Ex-convicts, what is the worst thing you have ever seen a guard do while in prison? I watched a guard casually ruin a man's life over a cup of coffee. I did a short stretch in a county lockup years ago. Not prison, more like a holding facility where everyone's waiting on something. Court, transfer, bail, bad news. Long enough to learn routines. Long enough to learn which guards treated people like humans and which ones treated boredom like a weapon. This happened on a night shift, the quiet kind where the TVs are low, most people are half asleep, and the guards start inventing ways to amuse themselves. There was an older guy in our pod, mid-50s, soft-spoken, always reading. He'd been inside before and knew the rules better than most. One thing he was obsessive about was his meds. Heart condition. Took them at the same time every night, every single day. He'd remind the guards politely, never raised his voice, never caused problems. That night, the guard on duty decided he was too busy. The guy asked once. The guard waved him off. Asked again later. The guard laughed and said, "You'll live." Asked a third time, visibly anxious now. The guard told him to quit whining and walked away. About an hour later, the guy collapsed. Not dramatically. No screaming. He just slid off the bench and hit the floor wrong. We all started yelling. Bang. Someone hit the emergency call button. It took forever for anyone to come. When medical finally showed up, the same guard stood there smirking, sipping coffee like he was watching a movie he'd already seen. Paramedics took over, loaded the guy onto a stretcher, rushed him out. The next morning, we found out he'd survived, but barely. Massive complications. He was transferred to a hospital and then straight to another facility. None of us ever saw him again. Story 2. I learned in under 10 seconds that bones breaking isn't the worst sound you can hear in prison. This was during my second stint inside. Medium security, nothing high profile. The unit was already tense that week. Random shakedowns, privileges getting yanked for no reason. Guards clearly irritated about something above their pay grade. When that happens, inmates aren't people anymore, just outlets. There was a younger guy on our tier, barely in his 20s, skinny, nervous, always trying too hard to stay invisible. He got pulled aside during a routine movement for allegedly mouthing off. I was close enough to see it, but far enough that I couldn't do anything except watch. The guard didn't yell. That's what made it worse. He was calm. He told the kid to get down. The kid hesitated, maybe confused, maybe scared, and that half second was all it took. The guard drove his boot down into the back of the kid's head like he was crushing something he hated. There was a wet sound I still can't forget. When the guard lifted his foot, there was hair and blood smeared across the sole and a piece of scalp hanging loose like it didn't belong to a human being anymore. The tier went dead silent. No shouting, no guess. Everyone froze because reacting is how you get next. Medical came eventually, but not in a rush. The kid was dragged away, half conscious, bleeding everywhere, and the floor got mopped before anyone even asked questions. Story 3. I realized prison had warped my sense of reality the moment I caught myself thinking, at least no one died this time. I was locked up in a northeastern state facility. Cold winters, older buildings, the kind of place where the walls look tired. People assume the worst moments are riots or inmate-on-inmate violence. What stuck with me were the quiet abuses that happened when the cameras malfunctioned or when paperwork magically disappeared. One night, a guy on our tier had a panic attack during count. Nothing dramatic, hyperventilating, shaking, couldn't answer the CO fast enough. The guard took that personally. Instead of calling medical, he ordered the guy to stand straight. The guy physically couldn't, so the guard cuffed him and walked him into a utility room near the showers. We all heard it, not yelling, not screaming, just dull thuds and short gasps for air. It went on long enough that everyone knew it wasn't about compliance anymore. When the guy came back out, he was limping, eyes unfocused, blood running from his nose. The logbook later said he refused orders and was relocated. Relocated to where? No one knew. A few weeks later, something else happened that still makes me angry. A kitchen worker dropped a tray during dinner rush. Loud crash, food everywhere. The guard supervising the line lost it. He shoved the inmate face first into the wall and slammed his head hard enough to leave a crack in the paint. Then he wrote the inmate up for creating a disturbance. Story 4. The quietest thing I ever saw a guard do caused the loudest damage. One day during food pass, I noticed he was crouched near the wall, shielding something with his hands. Later, during rec, someone who cleaned tiers told us what it was, a tiny spider that had spun a web in the corner of his cell. That spider was the only living thing that responded to him. He named it, timed its web repairs, fed it crumbs. He said it reminded him that something still chose to stay alive in that space. Most guards ignored it. Some even thought it was funny. Then a new new CO rotated in. During a cell check, the guard noticed the web, laughed, and said something like, "You're not running a zoo in here." Before the inmate could even speak, the guard took his baton and swept the corner clean. Web, spider, everything, smearing it into the concrete like dust. The inmate didn't scream. He didn't fight. He just dropped to the floor and covered his face. That reaction is what got him in trouble. The guard wrote him up for refusing to stand for inspection and left him in restraints for hours afterward. No medical, no mental health, just a note in a logbook. 4 days after, the guy stopped talking entirely. Wouldn't respond to guards. Wouldn't even look up. Eventually, he was transferred, and no one ever told us where. Story 5. The worst thing I ever saw a guard do was get punished for treating inmates like human beings. I worked in a high-security facility for a few years, and I was the kind of officer people love to mock by the book, polite, zero attitude. Not because I was soft, but because I was terrified of doing something wrong. I followed policy, explained myself clearly, and didn't escalate unless I absolutely had to. Funny thing is, that approach worked. The men there mirrored the respect they were given. I almost never had incidents. Other officers, constant problems, write-ups, confrontations, force reports, same inmates, same unit, different behavior. Administration never seemed to connect the dots. The moment that really stuck with me happened right before I was scheduled for a serious medical procedure. Staffing was a mess, so I'd been pulling brutal hours, back-to-back shifts for weeks. Everyone knew. In a small facility, nothing stays private, especially exhaustion. One afternoon, I was assigned to oversee the yard from the control booth. I checked the time, leaned back for a second, and my body just gave up. No intention, no warning, just pure fatigue. I woke up to tapping on the glass. One of the inmates was standing there, pointing at the clock and then miming a clipboard. Shift change. He could have ignored it. He could have reported me. Instead, he made sure I didn't get in trouble. I thanked him quietly and took over like nothing happened. Story 6. The moment that made my stomach drop wasn't a hit. It was realizing honesty had a shelf life. I was working as a CO at the time, still new enough to believe policy mattered. We were doing a routine escort from intake to medical. The inmate was cuffed, waist chain on, compliance textbook perfect. No attitude. No resistance, just tired and quiet. As we rounded a blind corner, the senior officer with me suddenly jammed his forearm into the guy's ribs and whispered, "Don't ever look at me like that again." The inmate folded with a sharp gasp, trying to stay upright because he knew falling would only make it worse. There were cameras, but not there. Everyone knew the dead zones. I froze for half a second. Then I did the thing they tell you to do in training. I documented it, wrote it up exactly as it happened. Names, timestamps, route, everything. Internal Affairs interviewed me. I told the truth again and again. Nothing happened. Weeks later, I was quietly reassigned. Fewer shifts, worse posts. Suddenly, I was hard to place. The officer I reported, he stopped working the floor and started attending meetings. Fast forward a couple of years. New uniforms, new badge, new title on the office door. He didn't just get promoted. He ended up in the command staff chain above me. My evaluations went through him. My schedule requests went through him. My career, in small but very real ways, went through the same person I'd reported for assaulting a restrained inmate. He never mentioned the incident. He didn't have to. Every denial, every stalled advancement, every not right now carried the same message. You should have stayed quiet. Story 7. The most terrifying thing I learned in prison was that pain doesn't have to leave bruises to destroy you. I did several years inside, long enough to stop counting seasons and start counting routines. Everyone expects the worst stories to be about fights, assaults, or obvious brutality. What messed with me the most were the slow, administrative punishments, the ones that looked harmless on paper but hollowed people out over time. There was a guy on my block who was holding it together for one reason only: letters from his daughter. She was a teenager on the outside, writing him every week, telling him about school, music she liked, normal life stuff. Those letters kept him sane. You could see it in how he carried himself on mail days, standing straighter, smiling for the first time all week. One CO didn't like him. No clear reason. Maybe the guy filed a grievance once. Maybe he asked too many questions. Doesn't matter. Mail started getting delayed. Weeks went by. The guy kept asking politely. The CO would shrug and say, "Haven't seen anything." Meanwhile, we watched that same guard flipping through envelopes in the office, reading bits, then tossing some aside like junk. The inmate finally snapped, not violently, just emotionally. He broke down during count, crying, asking why his kid stopped writing him. That got him written up for disruptive behavior, restricted privileges, less access to the phone. Turns out the letters never stopped coming. Another inmate who worked near the office later confirmed it. The CO had been holding them back on purpose. When the guy was transferred months later, a stack of unopened envelopes suddenly appeared in his property bag. Dates spanning nearly a year. That broke him. Story 8. I knew immediately I was in trouble when I realized nobody in charge was actually paying attention. I only spent one night in a county holding facility. Technically not prison, just intake and processing, but it was enough to stick with me. This was somewhere in the Midwest, nothing like TV jails, just concrete, fluorescent lights, and too many people cram into too little space. We've been picked up in a group arrest after a bar fight spilled into the street. Most of us were drunk, loud, and scared. The guards were annoyed from the jump. One guy in a holding cell kept saying he felt wrong. Not dramatic, not screaming, just quietly repeating that his chest hurt and his vision was going blurry. He was older than most of us. Gray hair, shaky hands. A couple of us tried flagging a CO and were told, sit down and shut up. Over the next hour, he got worse. He started sweating through his shirt, then vomiting into the corner drain. At one point, he slid down the wall and couldn't stand back up. We kept calling for help. One guard finally looked in, rolled his eyes, and said, he's detoxing. He'll be fine. He wasn't detoxing. About 20 minutes later, the guy slumped completely over and stopped responding. That's when the mood in the cell changed from chaotic to terrified. People were pounding on the door, yelling that he wasn't moving. The response was slow, painfully slow. When medical finally showed up, they cleared the cell, dragged him out on a stretcher, and left a dark smear on the floor where his head had been resting. A different guard came in afterward with a mop and bleach like nothing had happened. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just sit down. The next morning, while waiting to see the judge, someone who'd overheard staff said the guy had been taken to the hospital overnight with a heart attack. I never found out if he survived. Story 9. What shocked me wasn't a single act of violence. It was realizing the guards were more organized than the inmates. I did time decades ago in a large urban jail that had a reputation everyone knew about, but nobody outside fully understood. On paper, there were officers, supervisors, and rules. In reality, there were cliques. If you didn't belong to one, you learned quickly to keep your head down and your mouth shut. Some guards worked together the way street crews do. They ate together, covered each other's shifts, and made it very clear which officers were with them and which ones weren't. The ones who didn't fall in line weren't protected. They were isolated. Bad posts. Dangerous assignments. No backup when things went sideways. That power bled straight into the housing units. Certain inmates were untouchable because they were useful. Others were marked because they were inconvenient, different, or simply didn't fit the prison's warped social order. Requests for help mysteriously went unanswered. Cell doors stayed closed when they shouldn't. Count times got confusing. The system itself became a weapon. I remember one particular inmate who stood out because he refused to play any role expected of him. He dressed differently, talked differently, and didn't hide who he was. Instead of being protected, he became a target, not officially, never on paper, but in ways that everyone inside recognized immediately. Guards laughed at him openly. They sent hostile cellmates his way. They ignored obvious danger signs. When things happened to him, the reports always said the same thing: inmate conflict. No witnesses, no further action. Before we move on to the next story, make sure to like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Story 10. The worst thing I ever saw a guard do wasn't violent. It was calculated, petty, and absolutely devastating. I was in a medium security facility, and part of my routine as a CO was to supervise the common areas and occasionally assist with cell inspections. I took the job seriously. I treated inmates' belongings with respect. If I had to move something, I made sure it was placed neatly so they could put it back without hassle. Some of the guys even started asking me to handle inspections because they trusted I wouldn't trash their stuff. Then there was another officer on my shift who seemed to take joy in breaking spirits rather than enforcing rules. He didn't just search cells, he destroyed them. He would deliberately tear up letters from family, smear food all over personal papers, and even once shredded an inmate's handmade journal filled with drawings and poetry. It was petty cruelty, but the damage was deep. The worst incident I witnessed involved a legal folder. One inmate had been fighting his case for months, carefully keeping every document organized. This officer picked it up, dumped it into the toilet, and flushed it. The inmate came back to find months of work ruined. I tried to report it. The administration shrugged. He's thorough, they said. Nothing happened. It shocked me because it wasn't a moment of lost control. It was deliberate, targeted, and done with a smile. The inmate's rights were violated, his efforts destroyed, and no one held anyone accountable. It was pure abuse of authority, and it stuck with me more than any fight or shout I saw in that facility. Story 11. What shocked me the most wasn't a riot, a fight, or even the usual abuse. It was how calculated some guards could be in manipulating inmates for their own amusement. I was in a medium security facility facility, just arriving on my first week in a new unit. Nothing in my training prepared me for what I saw that morning. The guards opened a few cell doors in the day room and motioned a couple of inmates forward. On the surface, it looked like they were letting people stretch or move around, but it wasn't. One of the inmates, new to the unit, stuck his head out of his cell to see what was happening. That's when it began. A larger, well-known troublemaker was released first. He moved deliberately toward the new inmate. The kid froze, scared, unsure what was going on. The guards didn't intervene. They just watched, laughing quietly among themselves. The bigger inmate shoved the kid against the wall and started beating him. When it was over, the bigger inmate was returned to his cell, and the new inmate was left shaken, bruised, and humiliated. I later found out it was staged, a setup by the guards to see how new inmates handle themselves under pressure. It wasn't discipline, it wasn't protection, it was entertainment. Story 12. What shocked me the most wasn't a fight, a beating, or even blatant corruption. It was watching a guard sit by while someone slowly died. We called for help immediately. The guard in charge walked over, looked at him, and did nothing. She refused to call medical or emergency services. We kept shouting, banging on doors, demanding she do something. She just shrugged and walked away a couple of times. Hours passed. Finally, after a group of us physically blocked her path and demanded she radio for help, she reluctantly did. By the time medical arrived, it was too late. The inmate had already died. Story 13. What shocked me the most wasn't the violence or the corruption. It was how far one guard was willing to push people just to feel powerful. There was this officer in my unit who was as cruel as they come. He'd yell at inmates for no reason, confiscate personal items just to ruin their day, and made some ridiculous punishment games where people had to follow humiliating rules for his amusement. Most of the other COs avoided him. They didn't trust him, and honestly, who could? One day, an older, respected inmate who kept mostly to himself got fed up. He wasn't someone you messed with lightly. People in the block called him a fixer, someone who could make things happen behind the scenes if crossed. This inmate didn't threaten him with fists or shivs. He got creative. He started leaving the guards subtle but terrifying messages. Notes slipped under his door, hints that the CO's personal life, his home, car, even family routines was being watched. Nobody ever claimed it was the inmate's intent to harm, but the implication was clear. If you cross the wrong person in prison, they can reach you anywhere. The CO went from arrogant and untouchable to paranoid overnight. He started calling in sick to work, asking other officers to cover for him, and eventually resigned. Not because he'd broken rules on paper, not because anyone forced him, but because the fear he had sown in inmates finally came back to him. Story 14. What shocked me the most wasn't a fight or theft. It was the way someone abused authority when no one else was around. I was in a women's facility for a short stint, and at the time I was really young, barely 18. I had my own cell, and one of the guards assigned to my block immediately made me uncomfortable. She'd hover outside my door, make suggestive comments, and find excuses to be around me when no one else was watching. Most of the time it was just creepy, but you knew it could get worse. One night, around 1 a.m., the entire block was quiet. Lights were dim, most inmates asleep. That guard came into my cell under the pretense of a routine check and tried to corner me. She reached for my belongings aggressively and blocked me from moving. I tried to push her away and yelled as loud as I could, which finally woke another guard on duty. Story 15. I was doing a short sentence in a medium security facility. One night, a guy on my wing started screaming that he couldn't breathe. He was pale, sweating, and kept clutching his stomach. He was in agony, begging for a nurse or a doctor. The guard on duty came by, looked at him, and told him to calm down and wait until morning. No call to healthcare, no check-ins, just go to sleep. We tried banging on doors, shouting for help. The guy kept crying out. He was tough, built like a linebacker, but he was terrified because no one was helping him. The guard just ignored it. By the time morning came, he was gone, dead. Renal failure and sepsis. The guard had refused to call an ambulance or even check on him properly. It didn't end there. Later, when a few of us wanted to attend his memorial service in the chapel, the same guard stopped us, saying we needed to stay working in the kitchen. No compassion, no explanation, just blatant cruelty and control. Story 16. I was in a medium security northern UK prison for a short stretch, and there was a guy on my wing who clearly struggled with his mental health. He'd been in an accident years earlier and had lasting physical and psychological effects. He also had a chronic medical condition that meant he sometimes needed extra care at night. Instead of helping him, the guards mocked him openly. His hygiene, his quirks, everything. That night, one guard did the routine roll checks. Normally, they just glance through the observation flap and move on. This time, the guard saw the inmate inmate lying on the floor and assumed he was fine. He left. 2 more roll checks happened before morning. No one bothered to check if he was alive or okay. When morning finally came, a new officer found him unresponsive and started CPR, screaming for help. By then, it was obvious he had been dead for hours. To make matters worse, the same guards went through his cell afterward, cleaning it up as if nothing had happened. When I asked why they were pretending his conditions were okay for his family, one guard laughed and said, "It's not for them. It's for the next poor bastard who has to smell it." Story 17. I was in a short-term reception facility, the kind you go to between the county jail and your assigned prison. The place was ancient, mice running around, roaches everywhere, broken sinks and toilets, the kind of filth that makes you wonder how it's still open. I'm diabetic, so I need insulin twice a day. One day, my cellmate left, and I stayed behind waiting for my call to the infirmary. Time passed. I told a runner to ask the CO if he could let me through. The guard just refused. "You should have gone when I opened the door earlier," he said. I was trapped in my cell, unable to eat, panicking, because I literally couldn't survive without my medication. Eventually, the infirmary called down because I hadn't shown up, and only then did the guard grudgingly let me out. But the damage was done. He had knowingly risked my health for no reason other than laziness or malice. Story 18. I was a CO for about half a year at a medium security facility. One day during a routine cell search, I watched another officer, let's just say he clearly didn't care about discretion, open an inmate's locker and help himself to the snacks inside. Candy bars, granola bars, a small bag of chips, stuff that the inmate had probably been saving for weeks. The officer just started eating them right there, as if it was a joke. It was disturbing for more than one reason. First, the inmates have almost nothing. A small treat can be a rare comfort, a tiny morale boost, or even something to trade with other inmates. And second, the guard had to squeeze his way awkwardly into the cell, making a spectacle of himself while taking what wasn't his. He didn't even pretend to care that we were watching. Story 19. A friend of mine worked in a maximum security prison up north, and he told me about a guard in the segregation unit who had a reputation for being cruel and manipulative. This wasn't about smuggling or contraband. This guard would deliberately provoke inmates just to watch them break in front of him. One day, an inmate in a restrictive unit was acting out, mostly shouting and banging on his cell door. Instead of following protocol, the guard opened the flap, shouted something insulting, and refused to close it. Other inmates could hear everything. The man panicked, lunged at the door, and ended up hitting his head on the steel. He was dazed, bleeding, and terrified. Instead of getting medical attention immediately, the guard just laughed and walked away, telling other staff he'll learn to control himself. Hours went by before anyone properly checked on him. It got worse. That same guard would sometimes make inmates do pointless punishment exercises for hours, standing in awkward positions, crawling on a floor, or holding their hands above their head just for his entertainment, even if they hadn't broken any rules. Some of the prisoners later admitted they'd have bruises and sprains for days, all because of one guard's sadistic idea of discipline. Story 20. When I worked at a state prison, I saw a couple of officers crossing the absolute worst line, getting involved sexually with inmates. Not subtle flirting, actual relationships. It was insane to watch because these are people who literally control every aspect of your day. When you eat, when you shower, when you leave your cell. Having someone exploit that for personal pleasure is terrifying. One officer in particular used his position to manipulate inmates, giving privileges to some and punishing others, depending on how cooperative they were with him. It created tension and fear across the block because nobody knew who he was targeting or how far he might go. Some inmates were too scared to speak up. They knew their word against his meant nothing. Story 21. This isn't my story personally, but my cousin's, and I trust him completely. He's a convicted felon, serious crimes, and owns up to his mistakes, but he's also honest about what happened inside. He was 23, about 4 years into a 7-year sentence, and like many inmates, he aligned with a gang for protection. One day, during a routine cell search, his cellmate got into a minor scuffle with a guard. My cousin had nothing to do with it, but because he was affiliated with the same gang, the guards decided to punish him anyway. They didn't take him to ad seg like he thought. Instead, they brought him to a secluded part of the prison with no cameras and started a systematic, horrifying assault. They beat him and his cellmate repeatedly with batons, then deliberately inflicted sexualized torture using those same batons. They kept them there until the men were physically injured and humiliated, leaving them bleeding and in agony. Only after ensuring the injuries couldn't be reported did they dump them in AdSeg to recover. He told me the story with visible pain and shame in his voice. The horror wasn't just in the assault itself. It was in the deliberate, calculated way the guards abused their power to humiliate, injure, and silence him. It wasn't about justice or discipline. It was about exerting terror and control over someone completely powerless. Story 22. I did 2 years in a New Zealand prison from 2017 to 2018. The worst thing I saw personally was a guard straight up throw my parents' visitor application into the bin. No warning, no excuse. excuse, just a flick of the wrist like it meant nothing. I later found out this was a regular thing for him. He didn't care about the rules or people's families. He was just an asshole flexing his authority. It wasn't just that. Simple, basic requests that you have a right to, like calling your lawyer, were constantly delayed or ignored. You'd be told to come back at 3 p.m., knowing full well the officer's shift ended at 2:30. And if you did get through, they acted like they were doing you the biggest favor in the world. I've never felt so powerless. Before we move on to the next story, make sure to like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Story 23. There was this night guard on the medical wing, a short, dumpy woman whose face was constantly covered in scabs and acne. One night, I was lying awake in my bunk and noticed her at the guard desk. And then I saw something I will never forget. She picked at a fresh scab on her cheek, looked at what came off, and then licked it. Straight up put it in her mouth. I had to look away. I could barely breathe. At first, I thought maybe it was some one-off gross habit, but it became a pattern. Other inmates noticed too, and even the other guards would roll their eyes at her, but nobody really said anything. She treated everyone around her like they were beneath her, constantly mocking and yelling at people in the med wing, refusing basic requests, and using her position to belittle inmates for the smallest things. What made it so weird was how your brain reacts when you're locked up for weeks at a time. Normally, you wouldn't even give someone like that a second glance. But being stuck in a block with nothing but men for months, your mind starts noticing small things about women around you. Normally disgusting things become amplified in your brain because of the only female presence you see for days. And yet even that weird psychological thing couldn't make her remotely appealing. She was repulsive in every possible way. Story 24. I wasn't in for long, maybe 2 months in county, but I saw some shit I'll never forget. I'm white, and my bunkmate was Latino. For some reason, a guard decided to use me as a target for, well, basically whatever pissed him off that day. One morning, we were all in the day room. I was eating breakfast, minding my business, and this CO comes up and just starts yelling at my bunkmate for not eating fast enough. Then he turns to me and says, "You're looking at me funny, kid." I literally hadn't even looked at him, but he slammed his fist on the table so hard my tray flew everywhere. Moldy oatmeal and cold eggs all over the floor. Then he starts walking around, picking out people one by one. He pulls my bunkmate aside and drags him into the corner, then just starts punching him in the ribs while yelling about respect. People were shouting for him to stop, but this guy didn't give a single fuck. What shocked me the most wasn't just the violence, it was how casual it was. After he was done beating my bunkmate, he walked over to me and ripped open a bag of commissary chips I had left on the floor, crushed the bag in his hands, poured the chips onto the floor, and then kicked them into the corner, laughing like it was some kind of joke. Then he left like nothing had happened. It wasn't a fight or anything that triggered it. No warnings, no cause, just absolute arbitrary cruelty. The rest of the stint in that cell block, you learn not to look at him wrong or ask for anything. Requests for medical attention, toothbrushes, or even a blanket could be ignored for days just to assert dominance. One guy had a bad infection on his leg, and the CO just told him to stop whining or I'll make you walk it off. By the time the guy got actual treatment, the infection had spread so badly he had to be hospitalized. Honestly, it wasn't even the fights or gang shit that scared me. It was the guards using their power just to make your life hell for no reason. That stuck with me more than anything else I saw in there. Moldy food, no hygiene, physical intimidation. It was a whole system of slow psychological torture disguised as routine. Story 25. You won't believe this, but it actually happened. I was in a medium security prison for about a year, and honestly, I expected the usual roughhousing and tension, but one thing that really stuck with me was how COs treated basic necessities. One night, our pod had a small altercation. Nothing serious, just a shouting match between two inmates. The next morning, the COs came through for a routine search. When they finished with my cell, I realized something was off. My small stack of blankets had been shredded, and every single hygiene item, soap, toothpaste, even our paper towels had vanished. When I asked the guard about it, she just smirked and said, "That's what happens when people don't behave. Use your imagination." At first, I didn't get it, but then the reality hit. We had no soap, no toilet paper, nowhere to wash our faces, brush our teeth, or clean up. My cellmate and I ended up tearing strips from old t-shirts to wipe, trying to improvise hygiene. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was humiliating and degrading. Over the next few days, everyone in our pod had to ration water for basic washing because the COs had taken control of the sinks, letting only a tiny trickle out at their whim. People got sick. Some were coughing and breaking out in rashes because of poor hygiene. Requests to replace supplies were ignored or mocked. The worst part wasn't even the punishment. It was the casualness of it. The guards knew it would make life miserable and didn't care. They weren't stopping a riot or protecting anyone. They were just flexing power in the most petty and cruel way possible. Story 26. Brace yourself. This one still haunts me. I did about 11 months in county when I was 19. Nothing too wild in terms of my own behavior. I kept my head down and followed rules. But the stuff I saw the COs pull, completely shocking. There was this older guard, probably in his late 50s, who was universally hated by inmates and even some of the other COs. He had this habit of punishing people in small petty ways just to show dominance. One day during lunch, he noticed a young guy, maybe 18 or 19, standing in line too close to someone else. Nothing happened, just a normal line shuffle. But this guard lost it. He slammed the tray cart into the kid's legs, spilling food everywhere. The kid fell and hit his head on the corner of a table. The CO laughed and walked off. Instead of calling medical right away, the kid had to hobble around in pain while the CO continued his rounds like nothing happened. He literally made the kid wait 20 minutes before even checking if he was okay, joking with other inmates about how fragile kids these days were. The kid eventually passed out in the dorm and had a concussion. The most shocking part, this same CO would sometimes take harmless personal items like books, photos, or even small handmade gifts and throw them in the trash just because he felt like it. He had zero regard for the fact that these items were sometimes the only thing keeping people sane. Inmates would quietly beg him to return them, and he'd either mock them or say, "Rules are rules, my rules." Story 27. There was this guy in the dorm. Let's call him Mike. Mike had a nasty skin infection that had spread over his arm and hand. It was gross, yes, but also clearly painful. He kept asking for medical attention through the proper channels, filling out forms, hitting the request button, the whole thing. Nothing ever came. One day, during a routine cell check, this so middle-aged, big, and notoriously cruel saw the infection. Instead of sending Mike to medical, he laughed. Then, in front of everyone in the dorm, he grabbed Mike's arm, twisted it, and said, "If you were tough, you wouldn't be whining about a little infection." He held Mike's arm under the cold water fountain, forcing him to let the water run over the open sores, laughing at him while Mike flinched in pain. The worst part, other COs just watched. Nobody intervened. Mike tried to resist, but the CO was bigger and stronger. He released him with a shove that sent Mike sprawling across the floor. The infection got worse over the next few days because Mike was too scared to report it again. Meanwhile, this CO would steal personal hygiene items from inmates, soap, toothpaste, small towels, and hide them in his office, demanding little favors in return if anyone wanted them back. If you complained, he would either mock you or threaten to put you in lockdown. It wasn't just violence. It was constant psychological harassment and cruelty designed to make life miserable. Story 28. One night, I woke up in my cell assuming it was late because the jail was mostly quiet. A few guards were sitting at the desk just outside the cells. At first, they were chatting about boring stuff, sports, TV shows, but then the conversation took a turn for the worse. One guard casually mentioned something about racial profiling, and before I knew it, another chimed in saying something along the lines of wanting to teach a lesson to inmates of certain ethnicities. They laughed, joked about abusing authority, and made several comments about physically hurting prisoners for fun. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't one-off sarcasm. They were openly admitting that they would target inmates based on race, laugh about it, and even suggest ways they could get away with it. The sheer casualness of it made my skin crawl. You could feel the power imbalance radiating. They were literally sitting there in uniform, telling each other how they could harm defenseless people without consequence. I kept my head down and tried to ignore it, but the whole thing stuck with me. It was one thing to expect guards to be strict or annoying. It's another to hear them openly joke about racially motivated violence and abusing their authority. It made the idea of safety in jail feel like a cruel joke. Story 29. You won't believe this. What I'm about to tell you still haunts me. I had a cellmate, let's call him Eli, who was in for a minor possession charge. He'd had PTSD and used cannabis to cope. He was quiet, creative, and just wanted to keep to himself, making intricate models from glue and popsicle sticks. But for some reason, the guard seemed to take an almost personal dislike to him. One of the first things I saw was straight up sadistic. Eli had asked to be treated like a human being, requested basic hygiene supplies, and just politely insisted on his rights. The guards didn't like that, so they rigged the showers. They closed all of them except one and coated the floor and walls with some sort of irritant. They called it medicinal extract, but it burned like acid. Then they forced him to use that one shower barefoot. Within hours, parts of his skin skin started blistering and peeling. I saw him trying to shower again just to clean the rash, but it only made things worse. A few weeks later, the same guards escalated. A female guard, using her position of authority, called him to the guard's bathroom and coerced him into sexual acts. When this came to light, nothing happened. She was quietly transferred. Eli had no recourse, no justice. Then, months later, a murder happened across the yard. The guards immediately tried to pin it on him. Eli never left his cell, spent his days on art, and had zero access to the area where the incident occurred. Yet they tried to frame him, threatening him, shoving him, and even making veiled death threats. He spent weeks terrified, knowing that any one of them could escalate to actual violence at any time. All of this was happening while he was in for something minor, literally just 2 ounces of cannabis to manage PTSD. No history of violence, no trouble, just a man standing up for himself in a system built to crush him. Seeing how far these guards would go, physically, psychologically, and sexually, was worse than anything the other inmates were doing to each other. The abuse wasn't random. It was calculated, deliberate, and completely unchecked. Eli survived, but it left scars that would never heal. Story 30. I was fresh, eager to prove myself, and trying to get a handle on the rules. One day, the sergeant called me over under the pretext of helping him look under a counter for something. The second I leaned down, he grabbed me inappropriately and tried to assault me. When I froze, he smirked and said, "Go ahead and report me. I've gotten away with worse before." He was basically daring me. I didn't report it. At the time, being labeled a snitch in that environment would have destroyed my ability to function with both staff and inmates. I told myself I was strong, that I could compartmentalize and push it aside. But a little piece of me died that day. That memory is still with me every time I walk a block or hear about abuse behind the walls. What made it worse was that I saw how normalized it was. Other officers joked about his behavior, calling it harmless fun or the good old boys being goofy. Nobody challenged him. Nobody intervened. And it became clear, in that place, the rules didn't apply equally. Power was everything, and abuse was a currency. Meanwhile, I tried to treat inmates with respect. I spoke to them as people, not just numbers. I built rapport, diffused fights when possible, and learned that being fair but firm earned respect. I watched inmates handle extreme situations with more dignity than some of the staff did. I also witnessed absolute brutality among inmates. One night, a younger, bigger guy jumped an older man over a dispute about a phone slot. The older man's head hit the concrete, split open, and he was out cold. Medical got him just in time, but the blood, panic, the helplessness. It's a scene I'll never forget. The younger guy got locked up and transferred, but justice in that place was messy, slow, and brutal. Then there were the inmates in behavioral units, people who had been failed by the system their entire lives. Many abused, neglected, or abandoned. Some were violent, some were fragile, but all were treated as problems to contain rather than people to help. Even inmates who were notorious for the worst crimes could earn respect if they behaved. And yet, staff could act with impunity, like my sergeant, while the smallest infraction by an inmate could result in days in solitary. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Got a story to share? Drop it in the comments and let us know which one was your favorite. If you enjoyed this video, you'll definitely want to check out the dumbest ways people have died. Click here to watch it now.